Um, Look, I've just introduced a really important bill, and that bill is to ban goods made by slave labour. And sadly, there are millions and millions of people around the world, estimates say anywhere from 38 to 46 million people are subject to slave labour, and 10 million of those are children. We should, in Australia, make a very clear call on this. And the problem is that particularly with cotton from China, we just don't know if the goods that we are wearing are actually made using slave labour. So I was very happy to work with Senator Patrick on this, who talked to his bill that he introduced into the Senate, and how it got to be a bill not just about the Uyghur community and in China and slave labour practices allegedly going on there, but more broadly about a global ban. So thank you, and thanks for working with me on this. And Rex, over to you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. This is an important bill, and I point out that it has actually passed through the Senate. So the will of the Senate is that we shouldn't be allowing goods that have been made from slave labour from entering into the country. There's three reasons why this is the case. Firstly, we need to remove any incentive for anyone engaging in this abhorrent trade. Secondly, we need to be able to stand very tall in the international space, showing that we're actually doing something about modern slavery. And thirdly, we don't want to have Australian companies having to compete against overseas companies that are basically paying no labour charges. So it's actually harmful to Australian industry as well. I don't understand why the Morrison government did not support this legislation in the Senate. It's ethically, there is no reason not to support this. And I'm very grateful for Rebecca basically bringing this to the House so we can see whether the government has had a rethink on this. And I sincerely hope that they have.
My name is Carolyn Kitto, and I'm the National Co-Director of a charity which is a coalition of 30 organisations working to end modern slavery. This legislation is important because it's a win all round. Rarely do you get a legislation that everybody wins from. First of all, people in forced labour win from this legislation. The millions of people who are in state enforced forced labour, particularly the Uyghur in China. It's a win for consumers because once Australia has these laws, consumers can be more confident of the products that they buy. Nobody wants to be wearing anybody else's misery, particularly slavery. Third, it's a win for business. Business wants to partner with government in addressing these issues, and it's not something that business can be left to have human rights outsourced to it alone. And finally, it's a win for Australia. It brings us into line with the kind of legislation which is happening all around the world, particularly amongst those that would be our allies in these issues, the US, Canada, Japan, UK and the EU. Just this, in the last couple of days, the UK has introduced an inquiry into where their rubber gloves come from. They have a contract of £316 million with a company that the US has banned from sending rubber gloves into that country. Just last week, a report was released, 163 global fashion companies linked directly to cotton and forced labour of Uyghur people in China. The stories can go on, but what they are is people. And as Australians, we believe everybody needs a fair go. So we hope the government will support this legislation and that it will in fact pass through the Parliament so that we all win. Thank you.
Any questions?
Yes, what discussions have you had with the government, I suppose, since it passed the Senate?
Well, Rex, you can probably talk at best to government, and then I'll talk about individual MPs.
Sure. So in terms of government, look, when the bill was passing through the Senate, there were certainly indications from some Liberal senators that they supported the bill, but obviously had to follow party lines. there really hasn't been much in the way of discussion since the disappointing situation where they voted against the bill. This, in actual fact, the tabling of the bill by Rebecca Sharkey enables re-engagement. It enables the discussion to continue, and that's the point of it, and that's why I'm very grateful for what Rebecca's done.
It's interesting that when the bill first went on the notice paper, there were a number of government MPs that approached me and said, "Hey, this is a really good idea. This is something we need to pursue." So I am ever optimistic in this place that good things will happen, and I'll now be doing my best to talk to ministers about this need for this legislation. And really, it's just about, we know, we can determine through our supply chains exactly where goods are coming from. We now need to act as a nation and make sure that we ban goods that are produced by slave labour. So, as Rex said, this is great for Australian businesses too. You can't compete when labour is such an enormous cost with respect to manufacturing, with either businesses or indeed nations that produce similar goods using slave labour. So I'll be doing my best to now talk to as many members as possible, but so far indications are that many of them see that this bill has merit. So we'll keep working on it. Thank you.
I just remind people that my bill went to a Senate committee and received bipartisan support. In fact, I altered my legislation to comply with recommendation 1 of the Senate committee that looked into this slave labour issue, and so it is disappointing that the government didn't back its own senators who supported it in committee. And again, I think there's some will in amongst government MPs, and I'm now relying on Rebecca to do her magic in the House to hopefully get the government across the line.
Okay, just quickly touching on a couple of things. Just both of your current positions on voter ID legislation.
Certainly. I'll be voting against it in the House. With Centre Alliance, we do give the opportunity for both of us to, I guess you could have a conscience vote on every issue, but I have done a lot of research with respect to the proposed legislation. My take is that, at best, it is just a distraction. Where's our federal ICAC? We're coming to the end of this parliamentary term. It was promised at the last election. Where's our federal ICAC? So I see it as a distraction, and at worst it is voter suppression. On the face of it, you'd think most of us have pieces of ID. When you actually dig down and you look at the AEC data and you see how low the participation, even the voter registration is in remote communities, why would we support any legislation at all that would make it even harder, that would put up yet another barrier, particularly for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians? And look, I have enormous respect for the Minister for Indigenous Affairs. I have enormous respect for Ken Wyatt, and I would just urge Ken Wyatt, I would plead with Ken Wyatt, please don't support this legislation.
I won't be supporting the voter ID legislation. This is a voter integrity piece of legislation that is a solution looking for a problem. I have spoken with the government prior to this bill being brought in. They actually told me that this was not a problem. People voting twice was not a problem in Australia, yet they've brought this legislation in, and it does disadvantage particularly the lowest socioeconomic groups and Indigenous people. We need to address a much greater integrity issue, and that in fact is the integrity in the building behind me, making sure that our politicians, our staffers, our public servants are beyond any sort of misfeasance, malfeasance or corruption. Sadly, the government hasn't put that anywhere near the top of the priorities. I just don't understand why they're doing it, and I won't be supporting the legislation.
And if I could just quickly touch on the same thing about religious discrimination.
Well, we haven't seen the legislation yet. I don't think that there is a need for any change. I have not met a person who said to me that they have been discriminated on by religious grounds, that they have been prohibited from practicing their religion. We'll have a look at the legislation and see what comes forth. But again, you know, the fact that that has been given priority over a federal ICAC, I find really quite good.
Back in 2019, the Prime Minister opened a can of worms, and he had difficulty putting the cap back on the can, and now for some reason he's seeking to take it off again. I have seen a draft of the legislation. I won't go into the details because it was provided to me in confidence, but it contains a whole range of different examples to try and explain how the law might work, and that just goes to the real issue, is that it's really, really hard to draw lines in relation to discrimination, and we have laws in place, and in circumstances where there really is a problem, the courts can look at these issues, and they can do so understanding all of the facts and the circumstances of any particular case. I do not understand why the government is putting this legislation up. There will be different views amongst every MP in relation to its provisions. It would be much better if we focused on things that are really important to Australians, and one of those is a federal ICAC, and it's just shameful that the government has not done anything in this space in well over 1,000 days, and you know, I think the Australian public will hold them to account for that.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Thanks
much.
for coming
guys.
out.
Now we just